somewhere inside the red clay hills of central Georgia, filed away in a county courthouse archive, there exists a plantation record, water-stained and barely legible, that holds a single sentence no historian has ever fully explained. Or do we go in? It read, "No white man music has crossed the line of the Rue cabin since the incident of late summer 1857 music, and none should be compelled to do so. 4 masters, 4 men who owned human beings, who tore families apart with the same ease others' music broke bread, who commanded hundreds of acres and dozens of lives without a moment's hesitation. 4 of them refused, together and in writing, to approach a single small cabin at the edge of a cotton field. The cabin belonged to a woman named Cora Rue, and what she had planted around it, what she had done in that soul, in that silence, across the span of 18 months, changed something fundamental on that land. The full story of what she cultivated and why those men were so afraid has never been told, until now." Before we continue with the tale of Cora Rue and the Harland Plantation, take a moment to subscribe to Liturgy of Fear and drop a comment telling us what state or city you're listening from. We want to know where in the world the story is reaching you tonight. What happened on that Georgia plantation in 1857 did not start with Cora. It started, as most dark things did in that era, with something far more ordinary: land, cotton, and the brutal machinery of men who believed they owned everything, including time itself. The Harland Plantation sat roughly 11 miles southeast of Milledgeville, Georgia, out in Baldwin County, a region that by the mid-1850s had come to be defined almost entirely by the production of short staple cotton. Milledgeville itself was then the state capital, a city of political ambition and old Southern pride, where men in linen suits debated secession over bourbon and spoke of their people with a possessiveness that turned the stomach. The surrounding countryside was fertile, hot, and merciless. The summers in central Georgia during that decade were especially brutal. Temperatures climbed into the upper 90s for weeks on end, the humidity pressing down like a wet wool blanket, and the red soil cracked and blood rust-colored water after even the lightest rain. The Harland family had worked this music land since the 1820s. Ezra Harland, the patriarch who had originally purchased the 600 acres, was long dead by 1857. The plantation now belonged to his son Clement Harland, 43 years old, a man described in local letters of the period as precise, cautious, and deeply attached to order. Clement was not known for theatrical cruelty. He took no pleasure in spectacle, did not assert his authority through screaming or public punishments. His method was quieter and in some ways more absolute. He kept meticulous record. He tallied everything. He measured productivity in units that left no room for human variation, and when those numbers fell short, the consequences were delivered with the cold efficiency of an accountant closing a ledger. By 1857, the Harland Plantation held 41 enslaved people. Their names appeared in Clement's ledgers using the same notation system he applied to livestock and equipment: first name, approximate age, assigned task, and a brief note on condition. The cabins where they lived were arranged in 2 rows behind the main house, cluster of low wooden structures facing each other across a narrow dirt lane. They were drafty in winter, suffocating in summer. They smelled of pine resin, wood smoke, and that particular human exhaustion that builds up in small spaces over many years. Cora Rue is listed in Clement's ledger as Cora, approximately 38. Field and household condition: sound. That word sound was used by slaveholders to indicate a person they considered physically music intact and economically productive. It said nothing, of course, about who Cora actually was, nothing about her being born on a different plantation 1 county over and sold to the Harland estate at age 22 after her first owner died. Nothing about the 2 children she had carried and lost, one to fever, one to a sail that took a boy named Solomon north into the Carolinas before he'd grown tall enough to look his mother in the eye. Nothing about the years she had spent learning quietly and without announcement every plant that grew in the red clay of Baldwin County, what each could do, what each meant, and how to coax things to grow in places that did not welcome them. The 3 other planters whose names would eventually appear on that courthouse document were neighbors and occasional associates of Clement Harland. Randolph Sutter owned the property immediately to the east, a man in his mid-50s with a reputation for a short temper and a long memory. Wesley Pratt held land to the north, a younger man who had inherited his holdings and never fully shed the unease of someone who hadn't earned what he possessed. And Marcus Delavin, who worked an adjacent parcel along the creek, was the most educated of the 4, a man who had briefly studied at a college in Savannah and carried his learning like a shield against the world he lived in. 4 men, 4 properties. 1 shared boundary along the southeastern edge of the Harland fields, where the land dipped and the water table rose close enough to the surface that certain things grew there that grew nowhere else for miles around. That was where Cora's cabin stood, and it had not always been her cabin. The structure at the edge of the eastern field had once been a storage building. Clement, in a gesture of practical reorganization, decided to move it into rotation as a dwelling. He assigned it to Cora in the spring of 1856. The reasons were logistical. She had been handling more of the field work near that boundary, and it shortened her travels to music time each morning. The cabin was smaller than the others, more isolated, set further her music from the central cluster of dwelling. Most of the other enslaved workers at Harland considered it an undesirable posting, too far from the warmth of community, too close to the low ground where mosquitoes gathered in clouds at dusk. Cora accepted the assignment without visible reaction. She moved her few belongings into the structure in a single afternoon and spent the first night there alone. At first, no one paid much attention to what she did with the ground around it. The change began so slowly that it registered not as a fact but as a feeling A peripheral unease, the kind people in that era were quick to blame on bad air or evening humors or simple exhaustion from long days in the sun. Music, several of the Harland field workers later recalled. In the years that followed, ham music noticing something different about the southeastern boundary by midsummer of 1856. A smell, they said, when the wind came from that direction. Not exactly unpleasant, something complex and hard to name, green, sharp, faintly bitter, with an undertone some compared to burned earth after lightning. And others described as close to the smell of a church, cedar and dry herbs, and something they couldn't place but felt they should recognize. By autumn, those who walked past Cora's cabin on the way to the eastern fields began to notice the plants. She had been working the soil around the structure with whatever she could gather, cultivate, or coax from the ground during the hours before dawn and after the day's hay music assigned labor was complete. What she planted and what she allowed to grow where it already wanted to grow formed a ring around the cabin so dense that by October of 1856, you had to pay attention when walking near the door. There were plants anyone in Georgia would have recognized: sassafras near the northern corner, pennyroyal growing low along the eastern wall, black cohosh rising in clusters between the pennyroyal and the sassafras, a thick growth of what the older field workers called crow's foot along the south-facing side and along the path to the door. She music had placed rows of something none of them could name, a dark-leafed plant with small white flowers that bloomed only at dusk and closed before sunrise, its roots going down into the clay in a way that made the soil around it look almost deliberately disturbed, as though something beneath the surface were responding. She also grew tobacco, not the plantation's commercial crop, but a wild, ungrafted variety she had cultivated from seeds obtained through channels no one asked about directly and no one thought wise to investigate. This tobacco grew low and dense, its leaves broader and darker than the commercial strains, curling at the edges in a way that suggested age or stress or something in the soil that the plant was negotiating with. The woman who first brought this accumulation to Clement Harland's attention was not a field worker. She was Theodora Prout, wife of the neighboring planter Wesley Prout. One afternoon in late October, she stopped her carriage along the boundary road and found herself staring at the perimeter of Cora's garden with an expression her driver would later describe haltingly as somewhere between fascination and revulsion. Theodora prided herself on knowing plants. She kept a formal garden at the Prout house, maintained a small physic garden of medicinal herbs, and had studied several texts on botanical remedies fashionable among educated women of her class. She recognized some of what she saw, enough to ask questions. That evening, she sent a note to Clement Harland. The note was brief and did not fully explain itself, which in retrospect may have been more alarming than any direct statement. It read, "Mr. Harland, I observed today the garden of the woman you have stationed at your eastern boundary. I believe you should examine what is growing there before the season changes. Some of what I saw I could not name. Some of what I could name I would rather not put to paper. I remain as ever your neighbor in good faith." Clement Harland music walked to the eastern boundary the following morning. He later recorded the visit in his ledger. Among his otherwise purely numerical entries, the only personal observation he music committed to writing was this: visited the Rue cabin. Found extensive and unusual cultivation around the structure. Asked Cora about the nature of the plants. She was cooperative in manner and answered that she grew what was useful to her for cooking and medicine. She could not be faulted directly. The garden is in no way impeding the field work. I will observe further. That phrase, "I will observe further," suggested Clement had seen something he could not immediately categorize, and his instinct in the absence of a clear category was to wait. He was a man of systems, and systems required data before they permitted conclusion. So he observed further. And what he observed, hay music, over the following weeks made him increasingly reluctant to observe at all. To understand what Cora had actually built around that cabin and why it had the effect it did, you need to understand something about the world she inhabited, the knowledge she carried, and the particular geography of fear that governed the relationship between the plantation's enslaved population and the white men who moved through that world with such certainty. Cora had grown up on a plantation in Putnam County, one county west, under the ownership of a man named Peregrine Slade, a minor planter not particularly prosperous, not particularly notable, according to surviving records. What the records don't capture is what Cora experienced in that household, or what she learned during her years there from an elderly woman named Mama Thistle, one of the oldest people on the Slade property, who carried knowledge that had traveled a very long distance. The provenance of that knowledge is hard to reconstruct with certainty. The enslaved population of the Deep South in the Antebellum period included individuals and families whose roots trace back to West African traditions, Yoruba Dahomian, one that placed enormous importance on botanical knowledge, on the uses of plants not only as medicines but as spiritual markers, as communication between realms of meaning that Western European frameworks had no vocabulary for. This knowledge had survived the Middle Passage in fragments. It had adapted and hybridized with indigenous American plant knowledge and with the folk medicine traditions of poor white communities who shared geographic space with the enslaved. By the mid-19th century, it had become something neither purely African nor purely American, but entirely its own, a living system of understanding that practitioners kept hidden from the men who owned them for obvious and urgent reasons. Mama Thistle, by all accounts that can be reconstructed from later oral histories recorded in the area, had been a practitioner of what the people around her called simply the work. The specifics of her knowledge, what she grew, what she prepared, what she could determine from a plant's behavior in certain soils, were things she passed on selectively, and she passed a great deal of it to Cora during the years they lived together on the Slade property. When Cora was sold and moved to the Harland Plantation in 1834, she carried that knowledge with her. She spent more than 20 years at Harland learning the local flora, understanding what the red clay of Baldwin County could sustain, and waiting. She had not been passive during those 20 years. She had helped women through difficult labors. She had eased the suffering of children with fever. She had provided remedies for toothache, wound infection, and the particular ailments that come from long years of outdoor labor and extreme heat. These services were rendered quietly, and they gave her a standing in the community of the Harland enslaved that had nothing to do with Clement's ledger. She was not feared by the people she helped. She was trusted, which is a different thing entirely. And music, what she had built around her cabin, was not, in the practical botanical music sense, a threat to anyone's physical safety. The plants she cultivated were mostly medicinal. Pennyroyal was widely used as a digestive and a fever remedy, sassafras as a blood purifier, black cohosh for the particular complaints music of women. These were plants any knowledgeable person in music of Georgia in 1857 might have grown without comment. The wild tobacco served purposes both practical music and ritual. The unnamed dusk-flowering plants, which later accounts suggest may have been a variety of Jimson weed cultivated from seeds she had modified through selective planting over multiple seasons, were more ambiguous in their uses. And the ambiguity was intentional, because what Cora had understood with a clarity born from decades of observation was this: she could not stop what men like Clement Harland did with their power. She could not prevent the sales, the separations, the endless extraction of labor from exhausted bodies. She could not undo what had been done to Solomon. She could not protect everyone. But she could build something around herself that those men did not understand. And in that gap between what they knew and what she knew, she could create a space that was, in the most fundamental sense, her own. A space that Hey Music operated according to rules they had not written. The garden was not a weapon. Hey Music, it was a boundary. And it communicated to anyone who knew how to read music plants something the era's laws and customs made impossible to state directly. By the spring of 1857, word about Cora's garden had spread among the enslaved population of the neighboring plantations in a way that had no equivalent among the white planters around her. Field workers passing the boundary on shared labor arrangements brought descriptions back to the Sutter, Prout, and DeLavin properties. Women who came to Cora for help with their children or their own bodies saw the garden and understood, in different degrees and different languages, what it represented. A few began asking what they could do, what they could plant, what they could learn. Cora taught carefully and selectively, just as Mama Music Thistle had taught her. Clement noticed the increased traffic at his eastern boundary. He noted it in his ledger. He did not fully understand what he was noting. And then came the summer of 1857, and the incident that would eventually find its way into a courthouse document in Baldwin County. That summer was the driest in the region in more than a decade. By June, the creeks had dropped to half their normal levels. The cotton in the central fields showed signs of stress, leaves curling inward during the hottest part of the day, a defensive response to moisture loss that Clement watched with the tight-jawed expression of a man calculating losses in real time. The neighboring planters were suffering similarly. Randolph Sutter had lost a section of his eastern field to what he believed was a fungal blight. Wesley Prout's well had gone brackish. Marcus DeLavin, who had more capital to draw on, was purchasing water rights from a creek property 2 miles north and having it hauled by wagon. On the Harland eastern fields, however, the fields that bordered Cora's cabin, production was confounding expectation. The workers who tended that section reported that the soil there felt different, cooler, more yielding, retaining moisture in a way the central fields did not. By midsummer, the cotton nearest the cabin was the healthiest on the property. Clement recorded this observation with a note trying to find a rational explanation: proximity to the water table and natural depression in the terrain that collected dew. But the explanation felt insufficient even to him. The difference was too consistent, too localized. Then one of the field hands, a man named Tobias Ito, assigned to the eastern boundary since early spring, came to Clement with a report that did not go into the ledger at all. Tobias said, with music, the careful neutrality of a man accustomed to navigating information carefully, that he had observed something on the nights of the new moon. He said Cora came out of her cabin after midnight, when the heat had barely dropped, and walked the perimeter of the garden. She carried nothing in her hands that he could see, but she spoke while she walked, not loudly, not in any way that would carry to the main house. After completing the circuit, she knelt at specific points among the plants and stayed there for a time. Tobias said he had not been able to hear what she said. He said he had not tried to hear. He said he reported this because he thought Mr. Harland should know. He said it in a way that suggested he knew exactly how the information would land and had calculated that landing carefully. Clement Harland went back to the eastern boundary the following day. He brought with him Wesley Music Prout, who had arrived that morning on another matter and had expressed curiosity about the situation after Clement mentioned it over the midday meal. The two men stood at the edge of the garden, not inside it, not past the music outer ring of plants, and looked later in correspondence with Marcus DeLavin. Wesley Prout described what he saw. His letter survives in a private collection, referenced in a local historical study published decades later. Hey Music, he wrote that the garden was denser than he had been led to expect, arranged in a pattern he could not entirely attribute to accident or convenience. He wrote that the smell was insistent and difficult to locate, present in the nose before one registered approaching the place. He wrote that he felt an unwillingness to step inside that he found difficult to explain to Harland, which he attributed at the time to the heat, though the heat was no worse there than in the road. He wrote that Cora was seated outside her cabin door during their observation and watched them with an expression he described only as quiet. That word, quiet, appears in multiple accounts from white observers of that period when they tried to describe Cora Rue. It was not a comfortable word for them. In the taxonomy of observation available to white men of the antebellum South, even an enslaved woman was supposed to be readable, differential, anxious, eager to please, or, if resistant, visibly so in ways that could be named and punished. Quiet implied something else. It implied a person looking at you from a place you could not access and choosing carefully what to show you. Clement asked Cora in front of Prout to explain the garden. She did so in entirely reasonable terms. She named the plants he would recognize. She described their medicinal uses. She spoke of treating the minor ailments of the other workers, a service Clement had tacitly permitted for years because it reduced his expenses on the occasional physician. She was cooperative. She was clear. She answered every question he actually asked. He could not find grounds to object. He could not find grounds to order her to remove it. The garden was not interfering with her work. It was not on any land he needed. Twart music, Twart it was producing, if anything, a beneficial effect on the adjacent cotton fields. There was nothing he could point to. He and Prout walked back to the main house in silence. That night, Clement sat with his ledger for an unusually long time without writing anything. By August of 1857, the situation had become a topic of active conversation among the 4 neighboring planters, and the conversation had taken on a quality none of them, in private, would have been entirely comfortable acknowledging. They were afraid, not of anything they could name, not of anything they could document or justify. But the fear was there, in the way they spoke about the eastern boundary circuitous, a little too careful, returning to the subject and then retreating from it when they got too close to what they actually meant. Randolph Sutter was the most direct of the 4 in his private communications. He had visited the Harland property in early August, ostensibly to discuss a shared drainage concern, and had made a point of walking the boundary road. In a letter to his brother in Macon shortly afterward, a letter that survives in the Sutter family papers, now held at a Georgia historical repository, he wrote, "Harland has a problem he does not know how to name, which is the worst kind of problem for a man of his disposition. The woman at the eastern cabin has made something there that I have seen only in incomplete form before, and which I could not describe music to you even if I wished to. I will say only that it is not nothing, and that it has an audience among the other people on that property that Harland has entirely failed to appreciate." That phrase, an audience among the other people on that property, was the observation that Sutter, for all his bluntness, music did not push further, because what was happening at the Harland plantation by August of 1857 was not simply a woman gardening at the edge of a field. It was something more distributed, more social, more networked than the planters had frameworks to understand. The women from neighboring properties who came to Cora for assistance, for medicine, for counsel, for the particular kind of help that women with no legal rights and no institutional protection sought from someone who had knowledge they needed, brought things with them. Seeds sometimes and information. Small objects gathered from particular places, and they left with things: dried herbs wrapped in cloth, instructions whispered at the door, recommendations for what to plant and where, and something harder to measure, but consistently reported across multiple later accounts, a changed expression, a different bearing, as though the visit had reminded them of something they had known and been made to forget. Several overseers on the neighboring properties noticed this change in the women who made those visits. They noted it the same way they noticed anything that fell outside established behavioral patterns. With suspicion and tentative investigation that consistently failed to find anything actionable, the women returned from the Harland boundary with nothing that could be confiscated, and they had done nothing punishable under the rules as written, but something was moving. Something was passing along that network of visits and whispered conversations, and it was moving away from the planters' knowledge and further into a register they could not read. Marcus Delavan, the most educated of the 4, became the most vocal about his unease. In late August, he visited Clement Harland without prior notice and asked directly whether Clement had consulted anyone about the garden. A physician, a minister, someone with botanical expertise. Clement said he had not. Delavan said he thought this was an error. He said the situation at the eastern boundary was affecting the behavior of people on neighboring properties in a way he could not entirely quantify but was confident was real. And he used the word influence carefully. And then again, Clement listened. He was not a man who responded easily to vagueness. He asked Delavan to be specific. Delavan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The women who go there come back changed, not disobedient. Nothing you could discipline. Music changed, like they've remembered something. And the ones who haven't gone yet, they're asking. I've had 2 women on my property ask my overseer in the last week for permission to visit a sick relation at Harland, and there is no sick relation. They want to music, see the garden." Clement Harland sat with this. Then he said he would speak to Cora. He went to the eastern boundary the following morning. He stood outside the garden's perimeter, a fact he did not. In the ledger entry he wrote that evening directly acknowledged, but which is implied by the geography of his description. Chorsha musica tor, he called for Cora to come out. She did. He told her he was hearing concerns from the neighboring planters about the number of women visiting the property from outside. He told her he would need to restrict those visits. He said it was a question of order. Cora looked at him. She said she understood. She said she would receive no visitors who did not have his permission. She said it without resistance, without visible emotion. Quietly, Clement walked back to the house. He felt the conversation had resolved something. He spent most of the following week suspecting that it had not. He was correct. Because what none of the four planters had understood, what their framework of property and control had made nearly impossible for them to understand, was that Cora's influence did not require visits to the garden. It had already traveled. The women who had been there had carried it home, and the women who had heard from those women had received enough. The garden was not the source. It was the symbol. The knowledge was already distributed. In the third week of August, 3 things happened within 4 days that crystallized the fear building all summer into something that could no longer be dismissed as discomfort. First, at the Sutter property, a woman named Hetty, who had visited the Harland boundary twice in the spring, was found by the overseer to have planted something along the eastern wall of the Sutter cabin row, a low, dense growth of herbs he could not identify. He ordered it pulled up. Hetty complied. The plants were gone by morning. By the following week, they had been replanted in 2 different locations, harder to observe, and supplemented with seeds that appeared to have arrived from elsewhere. Second, at the Prout property, Wesley Prout discovered that 3 of the women on his land had been meeting before dawn near the tree line for at least 2 weeks. They were doing nothing he could clearly articulate as threatening. They were talking. He could hear their voices but not their words. When he approached, they separated and returned to their assigned quarters without incident. His overseer reported that when questioned, each woman gave a different and entirely mundane account of why she had been awake before sunrise. Third, at the Delavin property, Marcus Delavin found pressed into the frame of his study window a dried sprig of something he did not recognize. He brought it to a physician friend in Milledgeville, who looked at it for a long time and then told him it appeared to be a variety of plant mentioned in a text on West African botanical traditions that had passed through the college library in Savannah. He could not be certain of its local name, but in the context he had read, it was used hey music as a marker, a message. The message, as near as he could determine, was something like, I know where you live. Delavin went to Clement Harland that afternoon. He brought Sutter and Prout with him. The 4 men sat at music in Clement's study and had a conversation that does not appear in any of their personal writings in full, only in fragments in the courthouse document and in the careful half-statements that survive in correspondence from the weeks following. What they agreed on at the end of that conversation was this: they would not go to the eastern boundary cabin, not collectively, not individually, not to confront music, not to investigate, not for any purpose that required them to enter the space Cora had made. The document they eventually filed, an unusual step, a semi-formal declaration between neighbors intended to establish a shared position on a matter of shared concern, reflected this agreement. In the anodyne language of men who needed a legal veneer over something they could not fully explain, it stated that the cabin in question lay outside the boundaries of reasonable expectation for productive oversight, and that no party to the agreement would be compelled by the others to enter or approach it. They had in effect acknowledged a boundary. They had put it music in writing. They had done, in legal language, the one thing they had never intended to do. They had recognized with their signatures that there was a space on that land they did not control. To understand what those 4 men were actually afraid of, you have to separate the layers, because there were several and they operated simultaneously. The first layer was practical and had nothing to do with the garden's plants or their arrangement. Cora had knowledge, real, applied, verifiable knowledge about what grew in that soil and what it could do. The plant preparations she made were medically effective in the ways pre-pharmaceutical botanical medicine often genuinely was. Pennyroyal as an emmenagogue, black cohosh as a uterine regulator, various preparations as antimicrobials or analgesics. The women who came to her came for real reasons and left with remedies that worked. This gave her a position of authority and trust within the networked community of enslaved women across those 4 properties. A network no overseer, no ledger, no system of observation could fully map or contain. The planters could not surveil that network because they had no access to it, no language for it. What they saw as inexplicable influence was in part simply competence in a domain they had systematically excluded themselves from understanding. The second layer was the botanical, signaling the garden itself as a form of communication. Plants have been used as markers of meaning across many cultures. In the community that Hey Music Cora belonged to, certain arrangements carried messages legible to those taught to read them and entirely opaque to those who had not. What Theodora Prout had recognized and been unable to put to paper. What Marcus Delavin's music physician friend had identified as a marker. These were elements of a botanical vocabulary, a system of music meaning embedded in living things. When Cora planted certain combinations and certain arrangements, she was not only growing medicine, she was music making statements. Statements about sovereignty, about knowledge, about the location and nature of the space she had made. The men could not read those statements, but they could feel the fact of their illegibility. And that feeling, for men whose entire social position depended on the belief that they defined reality, was deeply and specifically threatening. The third layer was the most human and the most devastating, the mirror. What Cora had built over her music 18 months was a space that functioned as evidence. Evidence that the system those 4 men maintained was not total, not complete, not as absolute as its architects required it to be. Every woman who visited the garden and returned changed was evidence. Every replanted herb at the Sutter cabin wall was evidence. Every pre-dawn meeting at the Prout tree line was evidence. Every dried sprig pressed into a window frame was evidence, not of supernatural power, not of anything that could not be explained by human intelligence, human knowledge, torch musiculture, and the extraordinary persistence of human meaning in conditions designed to eradicate it, but evidence undeniably that the system had a border, a place where it stopped, and that a woman in a small cabin at the edge of a cotton field had found it, was standing at it, and had been standing there for a long time. The fear was not of Cora's plants, it was of what her plants represented, that the boundaries she had drawn was real, that the knowledge she held was real, that the community she served was real and connected and not contained, that 41 people, and then more still, across 4 properties, were living within the planter's world but outside it in some fundamental way, in a dimension of relationship and knowledge and meaning that the ledgers could not capture because the ledgers had not been designed to look there. That was what made 4 men refuse, in writing, to cross the line. Not the plants, the truth the plants were pointing to. In September of 1857, Clement Harland made one more entry in his ledger about the eastern boundary. It read, "The Rue cabin and its surroundings remain unchanged. Work productivity in the adjacent fields continues above expectation. No further incidents have been reported from the perimeter. The matter is considered closed for purposes of this record." The matter was not closed. The matter had merely become too large for the ledger, and the years that followed the summer of 1857 did not bring resolution in any tidy sense. History rarely performs that particular mercy. The Harland plantation continued its brutal and meticulous operation through the end of the Antebellum period. Music Clement's ledgers from 1858 and 1859 show no further direct reference to Cora Rue beyond the standard notations of name, task, and condition. She continued to live in the Eastern Cape. She continued to tend her garden. She continued to receive, in whatever quiet way was available, the women who found their way to her through the networks that existed beneath the planter's observation. The 4 men maintained their unspoken agreement. There is no record of any of them entering the garden's perimeter after August of 1857. Sutter, in a letter to his brother the following spring, mentioned that he had resolved the matter at the Harland boundary to his satisfaction, without specifying what that resolution consisted of, the language of a man closing a subject he no longer wished to examine. Randolph Sutter died of a stroke in 1860. His property in 1861 in the early months of the war and relocated north. Marcus DeLavin tried to sustain his operation through the war years and failed. The property was sold at auction in 1866. Clement Harland survived the war and the loss of the plantation system that had structured Hay music his entire adult life and died in 1871 in reduced circumstances. His ledgers passed through several hands before portions of them were acquired by a county archive, where they sit today, meticulous and cold, recording the dimensions of a world that is gone. What happened to Cora Rue after emancipation is not recorded in any document that has been located. This is not unusual. The records kept by white men of the period tracked enslaved people as property. Once that legal category dissolved, the record-keeping dissolved with it. She was approximately 42 years old in 1863 when the Emancipation Proclamation took effect in the Confederate States. What she did with the years that followed, where she went, whether she found Solomon or learned what had become of him, these things are not known. But the garden music was still there in 1866. A Union survey team moving through Baldwin County to assess agricultural conditions after the war noted in their report the presence of unusual and extensive botanical cultivation around a small outbuilding on the eastern boundary of the former Harland property. The surveyor who wrote the entry did not elaborate. He marked it on his map with a notation music that translates essentially to C note. No note was ever found to correspond to it. The courthouse document, the semi-formal agreement between 4 planters to leave one woman's space undisturbed, survived because courthouse documents are maintained with a bureaucratic thoroughness that outlasted the system they served. It was filed in a general property record section, not flagged as unusual, and it sat there for many decades before being identified by a local researcher music trying to understand an anomalous reference in the Sutter family papers. Even then, its significance was not fully appreciated. It was classified as a minor administrative record reflecting a boundary dispute, which was not technically inaccurate, only so incomplete as to be almost meaningless. Finally, there is the question of what Cora intended. The answer cannot be known with certainty because Cora Rue left no written record. Hey music, she lived in a world that had made her literacy a crime and her knowledge of music invisible. What she thought, what she planned, what she hoped for, these things exist only in the effects she produced in the document filed by 4 frightened men, in the changed expressions of women returning from her door, in the pre-dawn meetings at tree lines, in a dried plant pressed against a study window in the dark. But the effects themselves are a kind of record, and they tell us that a woman with everything in music taken from her, her children, her freedom, her name in any register that mattered, built something that 4 men with all the power of music of that era at their backs refused to enter. They tell us she built it from knowledge, from patience, from relationships, from the ground itself. They tell us she drew a line and the line held. What she planted around one cabin in Georgia in 1857 was not a collection of herbs. It was a demonstration, a proof conducted in soul and silence, that there is a kind of authority that cannot be purchased, cannot be recorded in a ledger, cannot be enforced or revoked by men who do not understand its source. And 4 masters stood at the edge of what she made and felt the truth of something they had built their entire world on the denial of, that what she carried was real, that it had weight, that it had in some way their systems of measurement were not equipped to quantify one. They refused to cross the line because crossing it would have required them to admit, at least to themselves, that it was there. And if it was there, if one woman in one cabin at the edge of one cotton field had drawn a boundary that could not be erased, then the whole architecture of what they had built began to tremble at its foundations. They signed their names to a document that said, "We will not go near it." And in doing so, they signed their names to something a music else entirely, to the quiet, permanent, indelible record of her power. History does not always announce itself. Sometimes it presses itself between the boards of a courthouse wall and waits. Sometimes it grows back in two different locations. Sometimes it walks a perimeter at midnight. In a language she music the men holding the torches cannot read. And it says what it says, and the soil holds it, and the soil remembers. What do you think of this story? Do you believe we've uncovered everything? Leave your comment below. What strikes you most about what Cora Rue built and what those four men refused to face? If you want more stories like this one, stories about the buried, the overlooked, the erased parts of American history that refuse to stay quiet, subscribe to Liturgy of Fear, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. We'll see you in the next one.